Okay, Rebekka, take it away.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me on this gray and rainy day. So obviously today I will be talking about grounded theory. And what I'll do is I will give you a little bit of a review about some of the different models that there are, because it can get really confusing. And then I'll talk about some of the key features that are common to all the models. And then I will share about my own grounded theory study that I did for my dissertation. So just to give you an example. But to begin with, I just wanted to quickly check in with you all and see what your experience is with grounded theory, if any of you have done this kind of study before, or if you are planning on using it, and just kind of see where everyone's at with that, so I have a sense for your experience level.
I'm familiar with it, but I've never engaged in any grounded theory research.
I was a coder in a grounded theory study, but I feel like I was just a pawn in a larger game, so I didn't really understand what was going on.
Hi, Rebekka.
Katrina?
Hi. As you know, I'm going to be doing my dissertation doing a constructivist grounded theory. So I've been doing a lot of reading, and I'm super excited to see how you've applied it.
Awesome.
I took 3/4 of grounded theory. I used some of the methodology in my own dissertation study and did some smaller studies before that, but never finished it up and came to the theory part.
Okay, great.
I appreciate, Rebekka, your comment on variance. I'm certainly not an expert, but we did a study and we used, and you may not have heard of it, it's called interpretive description, which is descriptive, which was designed actually by a nurse with the idea that in a lot of cases in healthcare, we probably don't go quite as deep as some of the traditional studies, because we're looking for certain applications. So it takes a little bit of grounded theory, but it allows you to impose what might be known. So you can, in addition to the information you're wanting to learn from participants, your framework can somewhat be formed by what's known. So I'm really interested in what you're going to present.
Great.
There's one more comment in the chat that you can't see, is Bonnie Malhotra says she read about it but has not actually created one. She really wants to.
Wonderful. Okay. Yeah, so, so I can't, here, maybe I'll go in the arrow. Here we go. All right, so I just wanted to situate it first. You probably all know that it is the qualitative research approach, although quantitative data can also be analyzed through grounded theory, but it is part of the 5 main approaches. So there's narrative research, which is really collecting of stories of individuals. Then there is phenomenology, which is looking at the lived experience of folks. Then there's the grounded theory that is not just looking into a phenomenon, but also then generating a theory. And ethnography, which is really looking at culture sharing group and kind of finding patterns. And then case study, which is looking at one particular person or individual over an extended period of time. And so I actually was thinking about maybe sharing some of the maybe better known examples of grounded theory studies. And I was wondering if any of you know of any grounded theory studies that are well known, that, maybe you didn't know that they were grounded theory, but you found out. And before I share, I wanted to ask you if you know of any.
In physical therapy, it's probably about 15 years old, the study, and actually people at Temple were authors, but it was grounded theory to begin to understand how we would describe expert practitioners.
Okay, good. Yeah. So I'm going to just share 3 better known examples. And the first one is Glaser and Strauss's study that took place over the course of 6 years. And this was in the 1960s. So Glaser and Strauss are medical sociologists, and they really wanted to learn more about end of life healthcare and how that process could be more compassionate. So they interviewed patients, they interviewed nurses and physicians, and just learned that the awareness of dying is extremely important in how those patients are being treated, and that very often there's an avoidance of speaking about death. And so this was a long, kind of formative study that I will refer back to a little bit later. Then the next example I want to share is Kathy Sharmas, and she is also a sociologist. And she did a study called, and sorry, I can only see part of my screen here. Oops. Okay, here we go. The Good Days, Bad Days, the Self in Chronic Illness and Time. And so she interviewed 55 people who suffered from diseases such as cancer, multiple sclerosis, and arthritis. And she actually did this over the course of 11 years. She followed some of them back, interviewed them over, and just wanted to learn about how these people disclose their illness, how they experience their emotions, and how they manage daily life. And then perhaps the best known example is Brene Brown. Her shame resilience theory, a grounded theory study on women and shame. She has presented this in her 2010 TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, and that has been viewed almost 50 million times. So this is definitely a better known grounded theory. And it's based on building resilience to shame through just being authentic and connecting with people. So what is grounded theory? So I have a couple definitions. So it's a methodology that employs a systematic set of procedures to inductively develop theory that is grounded in the data from which it was derived. However, there is no path, and certainly there is no way of knowing what you will find. The path must be forged as you walk. So it is kind of a tricky thing because you don't really know what it is until you do it. And it is usually a very good approach to use when little is known about a phenomenon, because you're trying to understand it and then create knowledge. And so it's not that you're testing the theory, you're developing it, you're generating it. So it's really 2 things in essence. It's both a method and then it's also a product. It does get a little bit complicated, as you were already mentioning. Some of you were mentioning like different approaches and being confused a little bit. There are 3 main models that I'm going to talk about, although there are more than that. There's also the feminist, there is the critical realist, and then there's the situational analysis. But I'm going to just talk about these 3 main ones. So I already mentioned the study on the terminal ill hospital patients that Glaser and Strauss did in the 60s. And so they are kind of the founding fathers of grounded theory. And they found that as they were interested in end-of-life care, that quantitative approach really was not appropriate. So they just decided to try something different and do these interviews and from there create a theory. However, fairly quickly after they actually wrote up their approach, I think it was 1968 or 67, they split apart. So that's why the classic approach only has Glaser there. So Strauss felt differently over time about how to use this approach. And so he and nurse researcher Juliet Corbin came up with their own method or with their own model. And that one is called Straussian. And Strauss actually passed away in the 1990s. So Corbin is the one that's kind of continuing that. And then there's a third model, and that's by Kathy Charmas. She's also a sociologist. She was a student of Glasser and Strauss. And that one is called constructivist. So I'm going to just go a little bit more into detail with these because they can be so confusing. So again, the first one is the classic, that's Glasser. And while they all share, so they all have, definitely have things in common and have the root in common. And I will also share about their kind of like the main features that they have in common. But the three main things that are different are the coding structure, the way the codes are gathered, I guess, then the philosophical framework and the use of literature. So in the classic approach, you see a two-pronged coding structure, and that's the substantive coding and the theoretical coding. And here, the researcher discovers a grounded theory. And this is really kind of indicative of Glasser's sense of the philosophical framework, in that it's a soft positivism. So it assumes an objective eternal reality. So Glasser says if you really stick to the coding procedures, if you engage in constant comparison, if you gather a lot of data, if you abstain from literature, this will correct for bias and make the data objective because it uncovers latent patterns. So there's something to be uncovered. So the literature is an absolute no until the end. And then the second one, this is Strauss and Corbin. They, you can see, have a very different coding approach. It's very much systematic and specified with 4 different steps. And Glasser actually criticized that because he said that this was forcing the data in preconceived concepts and coercing a theory. But then Strauss and Corbin said, well, we really want to develop a guide specifically for novice researchers, and we want to provide something that they can follow. And so as opposed to discovering a grounded theory, here a grounded theory is created. And their philosophical framework is kind of a combination between post-positivism and symbolic interactionism. So for them, there is an external objective reality, but it can only be known imperfectly. And the social construction, the reality is really also socially constructed. And through interactions, there's meaning. And Strauss and Corbin are also, I don't know if I want to say are or were, because Strauss is no longer alive, but I'm just going to say in the present, they are also proponents of using the literature as appropriate. So from the beginning, lit review is fine. That is not in the way. And then lastly, Charmas's constructivist approach is much more flexible in the coding structure. She really did not want to stifle or does not want to stifle the researcher. She says there has to be flexibility, there has to be movement, it has to be a fluid process. And there are usually, though, 2 different coding parts. And then the grounded theory is constructed and not created or discovered, but constructed. So for her, the philosophical framework is symbolic interactionism and constructivism. And those 2, to be honest with you, I really knew about constructivism much more than symbolic interactionism. They, to me, seem very related. And I think she uses both as sort of her framework. And it really, again, is sort of saying that reality is a social construct, and the interaction between the researchers and the participants is what constructs the meaning. So Glasser, though, is very critical of this approach because he feels that the researcher elevates herself or himself to the composer of the story and sort of intrudes in the perception And Charmas countered that we are part of the world we study and the data we collect. So we cannot not intrude. So there's this whole discussion about ontology and how much, what does the researcher, how much does the researcher influence the results? Okay, and then I found this graphic that I thought was really helpful because it really shows you sort of how grounded theory was even kind of where it came out of. So it really came out of these pragmatic philosophers' ideas, Dewey, Mead, and Peirce. And so Glass and Strauss were influenced by them. And then you can see the split early on, Glasser to the left, Strauss to the right. And then sort of the second generation, you can see that now Corbin is kind of taking over the Straussian, oops, sorry about that, grounded theory method, and Glasser continues to be used. And then there's also the constructivist grounded theory method and situational analysis, and then also dimensional analysis. So these are kind of the stepping stones. Are there any questions thus far? This is kind of like in a nutshell, the differences. So
Nothing in the chat, so.
Okay, okay. So I just wanted to give you a sense for what they all have in common though. And some of these are also common to other qualitative research methods. So you will probably know, and it sounded like a lot of you had already done some type of grounded theory or at least been part of it a little bit. So a lot of this will be known to you, but I'll just review it. Now, the main feature really is that it is an iterative process. It's a constant back and forth. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, maybe sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It's really not a very linear process, but it's just like a back and forth. The main components are coding and categorizing, theoretical sampling, theoretical saturation, constant comparison, memo writing, and then generating a theory. So I'm going to go through each one real quick.
There's a question in the chat if you want to, before you move on. It's when writing a grounded theory paper, do you typically specify which grounded theory model they are following?
Yes, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Because they are different. And I think because, you know, like I said, that the 3 main differences are really the use, and I forgot to mention, Charmas says use the literature throughout, but that is one difference. You know, like if you don't have at all any literature review and you just dive into the data analysis, it's a completely different process, and so that should be known. And then also, you know, where your worldview and the way you're doing the coding, that should be known, I think, by whoever reads the paper. So in essence, coding is breaking down data, conceptualizing it, and then reassembling it. And all of the models that I showed had at least 2 different parts to it. So the first is the open coding, and that's literally just going through everything that you have, line by line. And maybe different from a thematic analysis or content analysis, the use of the language of the participants is really used to describe what's going on. And also Charmas uses, I think it's called gerund coding, which is kind of making a like even a noun into a verb. For example, if you're saying, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of an example. Well, you know what, I might have one later on. But anyway, so just sort of using what you see rather than finding already sort of an interpretation for it. Then this may produce a ton of codes. And over time, though, as more and more codes accumulate, there are similar codes that are being noticed, and they can be grouped into categories. And then as the categories sort of crystallize and they become more clear, you know, which category stands out, which category seems to be very important and kind of, you know, really be like an overarching concept almost, and encapsulates a lot of other things, then the researcher forms a proposition and then goes back over the data again with these categories in mind, looking, does this actually really work out for all of my participants? Is this happening for all of them? So that's called the focused or the selective coding. The second thing that all grounded theory studies have in common is theoretical sampling. And that simply means that you don't know from the beginning how many participants you will need. So it can happen in a few phases. Maybe the data is analyzed in the beginning, even in the initial coding, and there are these gaps that become noticeable right away. So then on the left-hand side, you see this example. The researcher says, I'm going to interview some emojis to understand emoji culture. But then after doing this initial coding, says the happy emojis gave me some good information, but it was kind of homogeneous. And they mentioned how important anger is to emoji culture. I need to include some angry emojis in my study to get a more complete picture. So then needing to recruit more participants that will get a fuller sense for the phenomenon. This could also happen later on as the concepts emerge that might change the direction of the study. So to confirm that, you may want to recruit more participants. And even sort of towards the end, as the hypothesis begins to form, maybe there are gaps that become evident and it's not really clear yet. So that might be another time to recruit more participants. And they are really kind of gathered and recruited until theoretical saturation happens. So saturation happens when the analysis has been exhausted and no new data are emerging. And throughout this process, there's constant comparison going on. So this means the codes are compared with the codes are compared with emerging categories are compared with one another, and then the emerging theory is compared with the literature. So there's a constant back and forth. And actually, you have a really lovely quote here that I wanted to share. This dance of the collection, coding, and analysis of data, punctuated by the beat of the constant comparison, should blur and intertwine continually from the beginning of an investigation to its end. So it's this dance, which of course for dance movement therapists is nice to hear. And one of the really I would say maybe the most important piece almost is the memo writing. So that really means to just reflect on the data and record writings of these reflections throughout the whole research process. What this does is it's almost like a bridge, because you have the data and you want to get to the theory, but you need something in between. So as you are thinking about the data and as you are accumulating your codes and then maybe the categories, there is always thinking going on. And, you know, you almost like live in this. You live and breathe the data. And there might be a thought here, a thought there, or you sit down longer and you write down a whole lot, or you diagram something, you sketch it out. And this doesn't have to just, you know, be words. It can be pictures. It can be just a snapshot of something. And this is really what will help as you try to get to the theory process, because it sort of helps you to conceptualize and abstract. And then the last step is to generate a theory. And I wanted to just give you a few examples. So the theory, again, is really mostly derived from the memos and the diagramming. And here are some examples. On the left is Brene Brown's Web of Shame. In the middle is an example of how these theories, you know, might look. And then on the right is Dr. Minjung Shim. Her dissertation 5 years ago, she also came up with a grounded theory. And just before I go into my example, I wanted to give you an overview of just this back and forth process. So the research question on the bottom, the participants are recruited, the data is collected, coding begins, and maybe there's gaps. So on the right, you see, examples present within the data or from new data. So you kind of go down to recruit more because maybe it's not clear yet. And then there's more data coming, more data accumulating, more coding going on, then getting to maybe the focused coding stage. But then again, there might be some uncertainties and clarities. And so again, going back to recruiting more participants. So this is the theoretical sampling piece. And throughout that whole time, this constant comparative piece going on. And as the memos are written continuously and the categories become more clear, the theory builds. And once the data has reached saturation, the theory can stand. All right, so that's as much background I wanted to give. Were there any questions up to this point?
There was a comment that came in on the previous slide that I didn't know until you reached the end of this one, which was I plan to create artwork as part of my memoing process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think especially with Sharmaz, she is not even, for her, she says it doesn't even have to be this, you know, theory at the end. It can almost be a report. It can look many different ways. All right, so I wanted to.
Can I, Rebekka?
Yeah.
This has been really helpful. So I've done been involved with group, have done phenomenology. So I always struggle. So this what you've done is helpful because, and correct me if I'm wrong, when we've done phenomenology, you sort of do your coding and all that, and then you move towards themes that are sort of representing the voices of the people, but it's not necessarily the abstraction of the conceptualization. So could you, and you mentioned the memoing and the iterative, it's very helpful. I was just wondering if for someone like me who says, well, what's the main difference? How do you move, you know, to the level of grounded theory where you're abstracting or, you know, conceptualizing? Could you just elaborate?
Yeah, and you know, it is a very muddled process. I would love to say this is exactly how it's done, but I don't think there is a completely prescribed way of doing it. It is almost like it has to, through the memoing and through the constant comparing of, well, how do the categories relate to each other? What is their relationship? How do they connect with each other? You know, does the one build on the other? Is the one in between the other? Is it around it? And that's kind of how you begin to form the theory, because you're thinking about the relationships of the main themes, if you will. Yeah.
It's helpful, thanks.
Okay.
There are two more comments in the chat. One of them says, if you use no literature, how do you justify why the theory is needed in the study decisions, what settings are important, et cetera? And the second one is related. I struggle to understand for the same reasons. Has to know the literature if we want to know who we are studying.
Yeah, and maybe I said it a little bit too strongly. I mean, I'm sure Glasser doesn't say, don't know at all what's going on, you know. I'm sure that's not what he means. I think what he means is, yes, you need to know that there's something missing, that there's no theory or no knowledge about this phenomenon. That needs to be known. So maybe the lack of, you know, not finding that much is in the beginning, as you're trying to formulate your research question, is really what I guess, you know, then stirs you to do your grounded theory. So yes, you do some literature reviewing to understand what do I even want to research. But then when you realize there's really nothing about this phenomenon, so I want to create something, that's when he says, then don't go into the literature because that might skew your perception of what you'll find. Does that make sense?
There's another comment that I think builds on what you just said. It's not that you never need to look at the literature. You don't use the literature to create a theory. You just don't use the literature to create a theory. The theory comes from the words of the research participants, not from what other folks have already studied.
Exactly. Yeah. Very good. All right. So I'm going to just quickly take you through my own process. So pretty early on in my PhD, I decided that I wanted to research or do my study on refugees. And that is a population that's very dear to my heart. So I did my practicum at the Nationality Service Center, which is a resettlement agency in Philadelphia. And I spent a lot of time, doing dance movement therapy groups, sessions, etc. And so I began to think, what could I learn, or what could I research with this population in mind? And so, let me just forward to the next one. I kind of wanted to look at how dance, how creative and expressive movement might be able to be of use to refugees who have undergone trauma and who are trying to resettle. And I didn't know, if this is something that they are using in their lives. Is movement something that is helpful to them? Is, them coming from different cultures, is that something that they build on in their lives, that is like a resource? So that was sort of my intention. And I was thinking about what method would be appropriate for this. And quickly I decided not quantitative, because it just didn't seem like it would capture enough. I really wanted to give voice to my participants. And I was thinking about participatory action research, but I also, again, looking a little bit in the literature, realized there is really nothing that describes sort of, how even dance movement therapists best create sessions with refugees. So what, we need to know, how do they, how is movement used? How could that be used? And so I thought, okay, a grounded theory would probably be a good idea, even though I very much hesitated, because I never really understood it when I learned it in the 2 qual classes that I was in, because it is so muddled and so kind of all over the place. But I decided, okay, I will do that. And I also was thinking then, though, about the specifics of the refugee population. They are a marginalized, really oppressed population. And I wanted to make sure that the power differential wouldn't be, something in the way. And I really wanted to just, I guess I wanted to take that. I am the researcher, I'm telling you what to do, and this is what you're doing, and then we'll test you afterwards. I wanted to take that off the table completely. So I followed what's called the transformative paradigm. And this is a worldview that's very attentive to social injustice and social inequality. And it calls for the researcher to really include the participant in the decision-making process. And so I actually had my participants give me some ideas about what they wanted to do. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. And then in terms of which grounded theory to choose, I decided to choose the constructivist grounded theory, because that really lined up more than any of the others with the transformative paradigm. Because, this whole social construction of reality and having the interaction, the interactive piece between the researcher and the participant be meaningful. And I was thinking that is probably the most appropriate. So I ended up having 13 participants. They were from the Middle East, from different places in Africa, 3 men, 10 women. And in terms of data collection, I did have a small quantitative component. I'm not going to get into it today, but I gave them a questionnaire in the beginning. And then we met 4 times. And during these times, these were the movement meetings. So these were times that I really left up to them. I had a very small structure in place, just if people felt uncomfortable and a little bit awkward, but I really wanted them to have the say of these sessions. And so they brought in their own music. They shared their dances with me, and we just sort of spent time together. And, I'm a trauma-informed dance movement therapist, so I brought that knowledge, of course, with me. And that was very, very important, because they had experienced trauma. So, I was very much aware of that the whole time. Then I had interviews after the 4 sessions. We had one more meeting with interviews. So I had my interview transcripts. And throughout this whole process, I did a lot of reflecting, memoing, of course, but also I wrote these, they're called epochés. So they are specific little pieces of paper that help you talk about your assumptions, what you're thinking might be happening, and really completely kind of empty yourself of all of that and put it down. So you know that you're going to be bringing in some bias and some you know, preconceived ideas, but to write that down so you have it out. I entered everything into deduce, not the self-awareness pieces, but the other first three. And I cannot necessarily recommend deduce. It's not very user-friendly. I don't have experience with MaxQDA or in vivo, but deduce, I don't know that I'm gonna use that again. I actually only used it for the initial coding phase, and then later on I printed out all my papers and did everything just with hard copies, color coding. Just a quick glance, ignore the left side. So here you just see my initial coding of questionnaire data, session notes, interview data, then the focused coding of questionnaire data, session notes, interview data, and then the theoretical model. All right, so here just some de-identified little examples, and I'm so sad. I actually was looking for my folder with my materials, but our house is a little bit of a mess right now, so I could not show you an example of color coding and how I did it. But just on the left, you see the survey. In the middle is the transcript of an interview. And then on the right is just sort of field notes that I took during and after the movement sessions or whenever I met with people. And here, yeah?
Before you move on, there was a question that popped into the chat. Can you expand further about what you didn't like about, I assume it's deduce, is that right?
Deduce. Yeah, it is just, oh my goodness. And maybe I'm just not grasping the program in the way it's intended to be grasped, but I find it very difficult to move things around. When you coded, the colors are different each time. There's no system to the colors. You know, you will highlight a section and click on the code, then you will highlight the next section. There's no, I just didn't find it very easy. I don't know if other people have made better experiences. So I was talking about codes and categories and in vivo codes earlier. So here I'll show you an example. So for example, under the moving together brings back good memories. So that would be, you know, almost like the language of the participant, or moving together brings me into a good mood. So those were some of the things that I would, as I was going line by line, literally to sort of, you know, jotting down what was said. And then here are some examples of my memos. And I did, you know, I had them always in just whenever I had a thought, I would write it down. But in the end, I actually did put everything onto one document. I kind of tried to have it all in one place so I could go back into it. So you can see, you know, my thoughts for today, or, you know, what seems to be common here, categories that are coming to mind. So kind of just me wrestling a little bit with the data. And then some more, you know, starting to think about core categories, diagramming a little bit, you know, really wondering about what this all means. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. So then I wanted to just kind of give you a sense for what I arrived at, where I came up with things. And I did find kind of 4 core categories that then later you can see in my model how I connected them. So through the interviews, the participants were sharing that they felt a sense of settling. And I had 2 different sort of branches in the settling. One was a respite and downregulation of emotions. And I'll just read a couple of comments here. I relaxed and my emotions got better just by the movement and the laughter. I felt rested. My life is full of sadness, so coming here is a change in environment. Or movement gives me rest in my soul, I feel rested. And then I got, just as I was reading and thinking about settling and, you know, just really just sort of getting a sense for where the participants were with their interviews and the data, there was also this sense of almost like a rooting of the self, a strengthening of the identity. And I have some quotes here. I feel as if I am home and I remember myself. And here, this is from a field note. She was adamant about choosing her own music and moving to it. Later, she said, this was the Iraqi chobi. And here in this situation, this might not even sound like rooting, but I have to explain that this was a participant who, she was the only Iraqi woman with all Syrian women. And the way she said it, she was just so proud. She was like, this is that, because they had been playing their music. That's why, for me, this was a rooting of the self, her kind of, you know, really strengthening her identity. And then the mobilizing was also a core category that, that as the participants were speaking about their experience in these sessions came up. So there we have two kind of branches. One was stimulation and upregulation of emotions. I'm just going to read a couple quotes here. The movement time makes me feel very good. I love it. We were happy. And we were joyful together. We shared the joy of moving together. And then out of this mobilizing, there was also, and this was really more from the interviews afterwards, at the end, that participants mentioned that they felt mobilized and almost like hopeful about moving ahead in their lives. So here are some comments. I started thinking positively instead of negatively, and I gained more ambitions and more hope than before, and I feel that I am progressing. And since I came and we started doing these movements, I felt some hope and I felt like I'm stronger. And I'm gonna just share two more core categories and then just look at the time, okay. So the other really main thing that I noticed was connection being a huge factor. And this was both connecting to the other and connecting to the self. And so the quotes for connecting to the other: you danced with us and we danced with you. It reminded me of my sisters. We always did that together. I loved dancing with them. And the most important is that I got to express what I feel to another person. So there was this connection, and then also connecting to the self. Here I feel so good. I feel it's a me time and it's just for me. I do too much. I may fall over because I'm told. So like a sense of self-awareness of what's going on that might have not been there before. Okay, and I'm going to just very briefly take you through my model to explain how these sort of connect. And this might be confusing, but I'll do my best. So just kind of pointing out the core categories that I talked about. On the left, the blue kind of coming down, you see the settling that I just spoke of. And within the settling, the two blue components are downregulation and rooting of self. Those were the two that I had just read about. And so I'm going to just explain that part first. So so this is sort of my theory. As refugee clients connect with, whether that's a therapist or you know, a facilitator that is trauma informed and works with them through movement, as they connect with them, they are able to settle through grounding, breathing, stretching, kind of this down regulation of their emotions if they are having heightened emotions, and come to a place where they can actually strengthen themselves, strengthen their own identity. That would be the rooting of the self in the middle. And so that's the one piece that has the connection in it, and it has the settling in it. And simultaneously, now we're doing the green on the bottom, there's also a mobilizing that can happen, that also happens through the outside connection, that helps them to be sort of stimulated. And very often with trauma, you know, you have the potential for numbing or feeling disconnected. So this stimulation through movement, through vertical movements, through dance, working with props, and that helps the client or the refugee participant to upregulate their emotions, and then move to the right. We have this moving forward, which was also part of the mobilizing piece, and sort of have a vision, almost like a perspective for the future. And I forgot to mention the connection to the self. So this happens more in the blue phase as this downregulation happens, that there's a sense of what are my needs, what's happening with me, what, you know, I'm connecting with my breath. And that's how I felt those core categories were related to each other through this kind of strange and maybe a little bit complex diagram. Just one more slide and then we can have questions. So I did have quite a few limitations in my study. I did not engage in member checking, which was not possible because my participants were not all available. So I just decided to forgo it. And I was involved in all the aspects. So I absolutely, I'm very sure that my bias is throughout this whole, you know, piece, but I'm clear about it. And I wrote a lot about my potential bias, and I reflected a lot over it. So it's all out. In addition, I used interpreters because all my clients, you know, even during the sessions, we were limited because they were speaking Arabic. Three were speaking French. There was one or two of them were pretty good in English, so we could have good conversations. But for most of the interviews, I had to use interpreters. And so that may have skewed the data even more because, you know, the interpreters might have certain ways of translating things that are not exactly accurate to what was being said. So yeah, so that was my process, and we're done. So any questions?
Myself. Does anybody have any questions?
I really liked, Rebekka, how you, when you summarized your theory that couple slides ago, that was really effective. I was trying to remember, did you have that slide for your dissertation defense?
I did.
It was really, I thought it was really nice.
Thank you.
Sometimes very hard.
It is
Theories,
hard.
and sometimes it gets so, you know, so dense, it's hard for the person not familiar to process. So I thought that was effective.
And I was even thinking about that today. I was like, oh, how much should I share? Because I lived with this data, you know, I know it so well. I know these quotes by heart, and, you know, of course you don't. And so, you know, it's always hard to understand something when you're new to it or when you haven't heard it before. But I thought I just wanted to give you a sense for what my process was like, and hopefully some of it made sense.
There's another question in the chat. When creating the theory, do you use the data to support the connections you make between the core categories? Question mark.
Yes,
literature.
Absolutely. So the data is really like, maybe I can go back to even here. And this is, I wasn't really there yet, but I was, so here I had my codes, you know, connecting to self, connecting to someone. I also had connecting to something, but I took that out later. And for each one of these codes, I had a ton of quotes, if that makes sense, that really confirmed the codes. And one thing that needs to be clear is that as you go back doing the focused coding, as you go back over to see if those core categories are actually valid, they have to be true for all the participants. Otherwise, it's not a theory. It has to hold, this theory has to work for each person that was part of the study. So, all of them had to have, connecting to another, connecting to myself, something that was part of that sentiment.
Another question. Elise, did that answer your question? If no,
to talk. Hi, Rebekka.
Hi, I miss you.
So my question, I got how you get from the codes or from the data to your codes.
Mm-hmm.
Then you get from codes to categories.
Mm-hmm.
I think I sort of get that process. And then I'm
Mm-hmm.
asking about that last step from the categories to the theory.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering about that sort of jump.
Yeah. So quickly back here. So you see settling and mobilizing. Do you see that? And connecting to the other, connecting to the self. So I might have maybe written it might be more clear if I wrote it a little bit differently, but you see on the, like here you see settling, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the one. And how does the settling, the settling is sort of the container, and during the settling, there were these two components, down-regulating and rooting of self. So the settling is the container that holds these two subcategories.
Okay, so almost like a hierarchy.
Well, almost like they're part of it. Like if you go, sorry to go back and forth, but like here you have down-regulation and rooting of self. So that's
right. Yeah.
Right. And so that's that part. And at the same time, we talked about the connecting. So that happens that sort of happens as the settling takes place. There's connecting to the self.
Okay.
And so the theory model is really thinking about how do my different core categories relate to each other? How do they, is the one, it's kind of an abstract, it's hard because you have to really think about it in terms of how, is one necessary for the other? Does it hold the other? And in my case, what was very difficult was that I found these two things. I found that on the one hand, people were settling, but on the other hand, they were also mobilizing. And that's why I kind of put that on the bottom. This kind of mobilizing was happening almost at the same time.
Okay.
And with the two subcomponents, upregulation and moving forward. It's a little bit difficult to, sometimes I have to say, it's difficult to put it into an image, what exactly you're trying to convey.
Yeah, and that's sort of an art in and of itself that I think that's the next question, but someone else's question. But I was just saying that, so for example, here where you're saying the rooting of self and the connecting of self is part of a larger process. Would you, if someone asked you, would you have some raw data that you could use to support that connection, not just that the categories exist, but that they happen simultaneously or that they happen,
Well, that they happen. So I don't know that I can prove that. I can prove that they were all said. And this is, I think, where it gets very muddled, because this is not, you're not going to find exact proof for this. And I think also that's where, the good thing is you can sort of test a model, right? You can now do some deduction and see, does this actually work, or is this actually true?
Yeah. So I was wondering, like, the model seems like a little bit of a step where you as a researcher are saying,
you take a little bit of
see these categories in the data, and then it's like, I'm putting down how I think they relate.
Exactly. And how, because, and also, and like in my case, it's kind of, like I had 80 pages of field notes, like you're just sort of living in this, and you're part of this almost. And so you're thinking, how did I feel this connected? But I think that's also where it's very difficult, because you are clearly part of the process. You're not this removed researcher that is, able to very analytically say this, that, I can count. And that's why I did have a teeny little quantitative component, which helped. I had a survey that actually confirmed some of, like, the connection, the unity was the most important thing for my participants. So that was nice, to have. Yeah. But still, I think my whole intention was, this is going to be a different kind of study. And my background is in biology, so I'm actually a person that really likes to have, clear data. So this was a big stretch for me, but I felt that with what I wanted to do and with the population I was with, I just did not feel comfortable doing something that was very clear cut. I wanted to be immersed and yet have enough distance to create something that could stand afterwards.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies, I think it helps.
There's another question in the chat. Can you share a little bit more about your experience? I just sort of touched on this with your experience with the diagramming. What challenges did you have in the visual representations? How did you go about revising them?
Yeah, so I think my main challenge is that there was simultaneous processes happening, and it wasn't a linear process. It wasn't like, okay, now that there is the person is settled, now they're mobilizing. But it wasn't like that. It was, for some people, settling was at one stage, for others it was at another. So it was kind of happening at the same time, and it was difficult for me to really conceptualize that in a diagram or in a graphic. And it was almost like in my situation, it was almost like this, I'm moving it, I'm kind of trying to hold it, and at the same time I'm moving through something, and they're both happening at the same time. To put that into an image is super challenging, and to make that clear, because I know what it feels like, and I think that's always, the challenge. How do you conceptualize it? So I tried the best that I could, and definitely more complicated than I thought, because like here you can see some of this thinking about it. I had down regulation, moving forward. I was thinking, but what would make sense? How does this occur simultaneously? And so the model is what I came up with.
Bonnie, did I answer your question?
I think maybe what I can add is that sometimes we just want to have an answer and have like a recipe book, and this is just not at all how this process is. There's a lot that is kind of going back to the quote about this unforged path. You really don't know what you're gonna hit, and you have to almost embrace this unknown. And I have to say, there were a lot of weeks where I was just like, what do I do with all that? What do I do with it? But then as you just sort of sketch things out, and I got feedback from my committee members about it. One person wanted me to have it more in a linear process. I said, no, it's not, though. I can't do that. It's not one after the other. It's really simultaneously. So, yeah. Sorry, I don't have a very clear answer for that.
That's okay. So we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much, Rebekka.
You're welcome.
Is it okay for me to share the slide deck with this group?
Yep.
Great. So I'll send that via email soon, and I'll put another copy in the PhD hub for everybody.
At one point, for information, Drexel does has a site license for the in vivo software. So if someone does want are doing qualitative, that is available to you as a resource.
Would you recommend in vivo over deduce?
I've used in vivo, but it's the only one I've used. I think it was Atlas, another one that was I mean, when we were doing it, I think we were looking at two. So I'm not an expert to know, you know, to really do a comparison.
Oh, sorry. This is Justine. I've used Atlas and in vivo, and Atlas with their newest update, I've found it more difficult to use. I actually liked in vivo better. That's why I was curious about deduce.
Yeah, I have not used anything except for deduce, and I actually ended up using it because it was the most reasonable at that time for me. And again, I think what I did not really like about it was that the color coding was really throwing me off, because I liked when I did it for the second phase, when I did on my table, I was able to really find things very, very easily and quickly, you know, going from one to the other. And here you just, the colors don't match up. So that was what threw me off.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Rebekka.
Thank you. Have
Enjoy
a good
the rest of your
Thank
day.
you.
Bye.